My wealthy ex-husband's lawyers had spent weeks painting me as an unfit mother. It was the final day of our custody battle, and I was about to lose my son. But just before the hearing, I stopped to help an elderly janitor who had spilled his bucket in the hallway. I walked into the courtroom late, flustered, and certain I had just sealed my fate. And then, the new judge I had never seen before walked in and smiled at me. Before we get to the verdict, I'd love to know, what city are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for more stories every day. Okay, let's head to the courthouse. The morning of the final hearing dawned cold and gray, a perfect mirror for the state of my soul. For 6 brutal weeks, I had been in a war. Not a war of armies, but a war of words, of lies, of 1,000 tiny cuts designed to bleed me of my confidence, my credibility, and ultimately, my son. My ex-husband, Grant Donahue, a man whose vast fortune was matched only by his profound cruelty, had deployed a legal team that was the equivalent of a nuclear arsenal. They had dissected every aspect of my life, twisting my modest income as a freelance graphic designer into financial instability, my grief over the divorce into emotional volatility, and my lack of a large supportive family into proof that I could not provide a stable environment for our 8-year-old son, Caleb. It was all a lie, a beautifully crafted, obscenely expensive lie. My home was a sanctuary of love and stability. Grant, on the other hand, was a ghost in his own son's life, a man who had never once attended a parent-teacher conference or a soccer game, a man who saw his son as another asset to be won, a final victory in our bitter divorce. My own lawyer, a young, overworked but brilliant public defender named Ms. Chen, had fought valiantly. We had presented the evidence, school records, testimony from teachers, photos of the happy, secure life I had built for Caleb. We even presented text messages from Grant, canceling his visitation weekends at the last minute for business trips to Cabo and Monaco. The case was on a knife's edge. The judge who had heard the weeks of testimony, a weary man named Judge Miller, seemed torn. Everything depended on this final day, on the closing arguments and his final ruling. The night before, the rules of the game had changed. Miss Chen had called me, her voice tight with a new, anxious energy. "Elara," she said, "there's been a development. Judge Miller had a family emergency. He's been recused from the case." My heart had dropped. What? What does that mean? It means they've assigned a new judge to hear the closing arguments and deliver the final verdict. A senior judge, someone they bring in for complex cases. She paused. It's Judge Alistair Finch. Even I had heard of Judge Finch. He was a legend in the legal community, a semi-retired titan of the judiciary known for 2 things: his brilliant, incisive mind and his absolute, unshakable intolerance for theatrics and deception. He was famous for cutting through lawyers' elaborate arguments to get to the simple, human truth of a matter. He was also, I had read, notoriously strict and completely unpredictable. My heart, which was already a knot of anxiety, tightened further. We were no longer dealing with a judge who knew the history of our case. We were walking into a final exam with a terrifying, unknown proctor who would decide my entire future in a single morning.
And so I arrived at the courthouse, my final statement clutched in my trembling hand, my mind a frantic swirl of legal arguments and desperate prayers. The hallway was a chaotic river of humanity, lawyers in sharp suits talking into their phones, anxious-looking clients, stern-faced court officers. I was trying to navigate the crowd, my eyes scanning for Ms. Chen, when it happened. Just ahead of me, an elderly janitor, a small, frail man with a kind, wrinkled face, was trying to maneuver his large, clumsy cleaning cart. One of his wheels caught on a loose tile. The cart lurched, and with a terrible, echoing crash, it toppled over. A large, gray bucket of dirty water sloshed across the polished floor. Mops, brooms, and yellow plastic wet floor signs clattered across the hallway. The river of important, busy people simply parted around him. They shot him annoyed, disdainful looks, their expensive shoes carefully step-siding the spreading puddle, their important conversations never pausing. The old man was on his hands and knees, his face flushed with a deep, profound embarrassment, frantically trying to gather his scattered supplies as the world rushed past him. And in that moment, my own problems, my own all-consuming terror of the man I was about to face in that courtroom, simply fell away. All I saw was this stranger's humiliation, his feeling of being small and invisible in a world that did not have time for him. My lawyer was waiting. The terrifying new judge was about to take the bench. My entire future, the future of my son, depended on the next 5 minutes. And right in front of me, an old, embarrassed janitor was on his hands and knees in a puddle of dirty water. I had a choice to make. I stood frozen in the chaotic, echoing hallway of the courthouse. My world narrowed to 2 opposing magnetic poles. Ahead of me was the door to courtroom 4B, the room where my entire future was about to be decided by a terrifying, unknown judge. Behind that door was my lawyer, my anxious, beating heart, and my smug, confident ex-husband, Grant, a man who was using all the power his money could buy to rip my son away from me. Every rational instinct, every ounce of self-preservation screamed at me to go through that door, to be on time, to be perfect, to not give them a single, solitary reason to rule against me. But at my feet was a different world. A world of spilled, dirty water, of scattered cleaning supplies, and of a small, elderly man on his hands and knees, his face a mask of pure, heartbreaking humiliation, as a river of important, well-dressed people parted around him like he was a rock in a stream. He was invisible to them, a nuisance, an obstacle. And in that moment, my own public humiliation, the weeks of being called an unfit mother, of having my character assassinated by lawyers in expensive suits, seemed to connect with his. I saw in his shame a reflection of my own. I saw in their disdainful, impatient glances the same coldness I saw in my ex-husband's eyes. To hell with it, a small, defiant voice whispered in my soul. If I lose my son because I took 2 minutes out of my life to show a stranger a basic human decency, then the world is already so broken that it doesn't matter what happens in that courtroom. The decision wasn't even a decision. It was a reflex. It was the only thing a person with a shred of a soul could do. I walked over and knelt down on the cold, wet floor, the hem of my carefully chosen courtroom-appropriate dress instantly soaking up the gray, dirty water. "Are you all right, sir?" I asked softly. The janitor looked up at me, his eyes watery and pale blue, full of a startled surprise. He was so used to being invisible that my simple act of acknowledgement seemed to shock him. "Oh, miss," he stammered, his hands trembling as he tried to gather the scattered spray bottles. "You shouldn't. You'll ruin your clothes. I'm so sorry. I'm just so clumsy today." "Don't you dare apologize," I said, my voice firm but kind. "It was an accident. Let me help you." Together, we began to clean up the mess. I helped him wring out the heavy, sodden mop head. I gathered the rolling bottles of cleaner and placed them back in his cart. We worked in a small, companionable silence, an island of quiet cooperation in the middle of the rushing, indifferent hallway. It was during this small act of grace that the devil himself walked by. I looked up and saw my ex-husband, Grant, and his lead attorney walking towards the courtroom. Grant saw me. He saw me on my hands and knees, my dress stained, helping the janitor. He didn't stop. He didn't even break his stride. He just looked down at me, a slow, contemptuous, and utterly triumphant smirk spreading across his face. It was a look that said everything. "This is who you are," it said, "a servant, a nobody. And this is why you will always, always lose to me." He then turned to his lawyer and whispered something, and they both shared a small, cruel laugh at my expense before disappearing into the courtroom. The old me would have been shattered by that look. But the woman kneeling on that wet floor was different. His contempt, for the first time, had no power over me. I just looked back at him, my expression unreadable. And then I turned my attention back to the kind old man beside me. "There," I said, after we had finally righted his cart and cleaned up the worst of the spill. "All sorted." The janitor looked at me, his eyes full of a profound and deeply moving gratitude. "Thank you, miss," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "God bless you. You have a good and kind heart. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." His words were a strange, unexpected blessing, a small piece of armor for the battle I was about to face. I looked at my watch and my own heart plummeted. I was 10 minutes late. "I have to go," I said, a new wave of real panic hitting me. I ran the rest of the way down the hall, my sensible courtroom heels clicking frantically on the marble floor. I reached the heavy, imposing doors of courtroom 4B. I could hear the faint sound of voices from within. The hearing had already started without me. My lawyer, Miss Chen, was probably having a panic attack. Grant was probably already telling the new judge what an irresponsible, tardy mother I was. I took one last, deep, shuddering breath, bracing myself for the cold fury of the judge and the triumphant smirk of my ex-husband. I pushed open the heavy courtroom door, my apology already forming on my lips. My lawyer looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. My ex-husband smirked, a look of absolute victory on his face. The new judge was already on the bench, a formidable, dark-robed figure, his back to me as he reviewed a stack of papers. My act of kindness, I was certain in that moment, had just cost me my son. I had no idea it was the one and only thing that was about to save him. I pushed open the heavy courtroom door, and the sound of my own ragged breathing was swallowed by a sudden, profound silence. Every head in the room swiveled in my direction. I saw the jury box, filled with tired, impassive faces. I saw the gallery, a small collection of court observers and, to my horror, a single local news reporter. I saw my ex-husband, Grant, and his lead attorney, who looked at me and gave his lead attorney a slow, triumphant, almost imperceptible smirk.
And I saw my own lawyer, the young but fierce Miss Chen, whose face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "I am so sorry, Your Honor," I whispered, my voice a hoarse croak as I scurried to my seat. I was detained unexpectedly in the hallway." The judge, a formidable figure in a high-backed leather chair, did not turn around. His back was to me, his shoulders broad and imposing under the black robe, as he continued to review a stack of papers on his bench. "Be seated, Miss Vance," a deep, gravelly voice rumbled, the sound echoing in the silent, wood-paneled room. The voice was unfamiliar, laced with an authority that sent a fresh chill of terror down my spine. This was him, the legend, Judge Alistair Finch. Miss Chen leaned towards me, her voice frantic. "Where were you? He's been on the bench for 5 minutes. He's a stickler for punctuality. This is a disaster." Grant's lawyer, a man whose smug, reptilian smile I had come to loathe, stood up to begin his closing argument. He used my tardiness as his opening salvo. "Your Honor," he began, his voice dripping with condescending pity, "as you can see, the defendant's chaotic and irresponsible nature, a nature we have painstakingly detailed for this court over the past few weeks, continues even on this, the most crucial of days. it shows a blatant disrespect for this court, for the seriousness of these proceedings, and ultimately for the well-being of her own child. I could only sit there and take it, my face burning with a shame I didn't deserve. I risked a glance at Grant. He was watching me, his eyes glittering with a cold, victorious light. He was enjoying this. He was savoring my demise. His lawyer continued for another 20 minutes, a masterful performance of character assassination, weaving a tapestry of half-truths and outright lies designed to paint me as an unstable, unfit mother. When he finally sat down, the air in the room was heavy with his accusations. Miss Chen, to her credit, did her best. She stood, her voice trembling slightly, but full of a passionate belief in my case. She spoke of the evidence we had presented, of the testimony from Caleb's teachers, of my unwavering devotion as a mother. She spoke of Grant's manipulation, his frequent absences, his attempts to use his wealth as a weapon. But her arguments, however true, felt like a desperate rearguard action against a far more powerful enemy. When she too sat down, a deep, final silence fell over the courtroom. This was it. The moment of judgment. My entire life, my future with my son, had been reduced to this single, terrible, and silent moment. The judge on the bench had not turned around. He just sat there, looking down at his papers. The ticking of the large clock on the courtroom wall was the only sound. Each second, a hammer blow against my heart. I felt a wave of absolute despair wash over me. I had lost. I had fought so hard, and in the end, my simple act of kindness in a hallway was going to be the clumsy mistake that cost me everything. He finally put down the papers he was reading. He took off a pair of small, gold-rimmed reading glasses and placed them deliberately on his desk. And then, with a slow, almost agonizing deliberation that seemed to stretch for an eternity, he swiveled his large black leather chair around to face the courtroom for the very first time. And the world stopped. The air left my lungs in a silent gasp. My mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. It was not possible. It was a dream. A hallucination brought on by stress and despair. Because the man sitting on the judge's bench, the man wrapped in the formidable black robes of absolute judicial authority, the legendary, terrifying, and unpredictable Judge Alistair Finch, was the janitor. He was the same kind, frail, elderly man from the hallway. The same watery, pale blue eyes, the same tired, wrinkled face. The only thing different was that the shame and embarrassment he had worn before were now gone, replaced by an expression of calm, intelligent, and unshakable power. He looked out over the courtroom, his gaze sweeping past the lawyers, past my stunned, disbelieving face, past my ex-husband, who was looking at him with a mixture of fear and respect, completely and totally oblivious. Grant didn't recognize him. Of course he didn't. He hadn't even given the janitor a second glance in the hallway. To Grant, the man was just a piece of the scenery, an invisible, unimportant fixture in his world. But I saw him, and he saw me. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second across the silent courtroom. He gave me no smile, no sign of recognition at all, except for a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture so small, so subtle, that no one else in the world could have possibly seen it. But I did. He cleared his throat, the sound a low rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. He was about to speak. He was about to deliver his ruling. My ex-husband looked at the man on the bench and saw a judge, a stranger who held our fates in his hands. But I saw the janitor whose dignity I had defended, whose mess I had helped clean just moments ago. He held my entire future in those same hands.
And in that terrifying, electrifying moment, I had no idea if my act of kindness had just earned me his mercy, or if my unforgivable tardiness had just earned me his wrath. I stood before the bench, my heart a wild, frantic bird in my chest, and I waited for the axe to fall. The courtroom was a vacuum of suspended time. Every person in the room, the lawyers, the jury, my own sneering ex-husband, all waiting for the new, formidable Judge Alistair Finch to deliver his verdict on my life. His face, the kind, tired face of the janitor from the hallway, was now an unreadable mask of judicial authority. The small, almost imperceptible nod he had given me could have meant anything. It could have been a simple acknowledgement. It could have been a final, pitying farewell. He put on his reading glasses and looked down at the pile of documents before him, the long and sordid history of my custody battle. He began, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded immediate and absolute respect. I have spent the last 48 hours reviewing the entirety of the testimony and evidence presented in the case of Vance versus Donahue. It has been a contentious proceeding. He first looked toward my lawyer, Miss Chen. "Counselor," he said, "you have presented a compelling and well-documented case for your client's fitness as a mother. You have provided ample evidence of her stable home life, her deep involvement in her son's education, and a consistent pattern of loving, attentive parenting." A tiny, fragile flicker of hope ignited in my chest. He had seen the truth of my evidence. He then turned his gaze upon Grant's legal team. "And you, counsel," he said to my ex-husband's lead attorney, "have presented a vigorous, if largely circumstantial, case against Miss Vance. You have used your client's considerable financial resources to paint a picture of her as emotionally volatile and financially insecure." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "It has been a masterful and very expensive performance of character assassination." Grant's lawyer preened slightly, taking the backhanded compliment as a sign of victory. Grant himself sat up a little straighter, a confident smirk beginning to form on his lips.
The judge took off his glasses and placed them deliberately on his desk. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench, and he looked out over the courtroom, not at the lawyers, not at me, but as if he were addressing the very concept of justice itself. "A custody case, however," he said, his voice now softer, more philosophical, "is not merely a matter of financial statements and hearsay. At its heart, it is a question of character. It is a question of who is best equipped to teach a child not just how to navigate the world, but how to be a good and decent human being within it." He then looked directly at me, and his eyes were the eyes of the janitor once more. "This morning," he began, his voice taking on a new, storytelling quality. "Before I took this bench, I was walking down the main hallway. I was conducting a small, personal experiment. I wanted to see the true character of the people who walk these halls. I witnessed a small, clumsy accident. An elderly worker, a janitor, spilled his cart. A simple mistake. A moment of quiet, personal humiliation for him." He let his gaze drift from me to my ex-husband. I watched as dozens of important, busy people with urgent matters and expensive suits, walked past him, some with annoyance, some with disdain, most without a second glance. They saw an obstacle, a problem. They did not see a person. His eyes, now as sharp and as cold as a surgeon's scalpel, landed on Grant. "I saw you, Mr. Donahue," he said, his voice now a low, dangerous growl. "You walked past him. You saw a woman, your ex-wife, the mother of your child, on her hands and knees in a puddle of dirty water helping this man, and you smirked. You turned to your lawyer, and you shared a laugh at her expense. You saw a moment of profound human decency, and you interpreted it as a moment of weakness to be mocked and exploited. The color began to drain from Grant's face. His triumphant smirk faltered, replaced by a look of dawning, horrified confusion. He was replaying the scene in his mind, but now the context was shifting in a terrible, catastrophic way. Then the judge turned his gaze back to me, and his expression softened, not with pity, but with a deep, profound, and undeniable respect. "And I saw you, Miss Vance," he said. "You were late for the most important day of your life. You had every reason in the world to ignore that man, to rush past him like everyone else. But you did not. You stopped. You knelt in the dirty water. You sacrificed your own immediate, critical needs, your own dignity, to preserve his. You showed kindness and compassion when you had absolutely nothing to gain from it, and by all rational accounts, everything to lose." He leaned forward, his voice now a powerful boom that filled the silent courtroom. "The central argument of your case, Mr. Donahue, has been that you are the superior parent because of your status, your wealth, your power. But what you have just demonstrated to me beyond any reasonable doubt is that you lack the most fundamental qualification to be a father, a decent and compassionate heart. You are a man who would step over a struggling person to get ahead. Miss Vance is a woman who would stop to help them up, even at great personal cost." He finally, mercifully, looked away from Grant's pale, horrified face. He picked up his gavel. "I have heard the arguments. I have reviewed the evidence. And I have seen the truth of these two individuals' characters with my own two eyes." In that moment, I finally understood. The trial wasn't just about the evidence presented by the lawyers. There had been a second, secret trial happening all along, a trial of character held in a wet and dirty hallway with only one all-important witness. And the verdict was about to be read. I stood in the silent courtroom, my entire world hanging in the balance, my gaze fixed on the man on the bench. He was no longer a judge or a janitor. He was the arbiter of my future, the single person who would decide if I was worthy of being a mother to my own child. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. My ex-husband, Grant, was now looking at the judge with a new, dawning sense of pure animal terror. The memory of his smug, cruel smirk in the hallway, the smirk that the judge had just described with such cold precision, was now a ghostly accusation hanging over his head. Judge Alistair Finch finally looked down at the official documents before him, his face once again an impassive mask of judicial authority. "I have reviewed all the evidence and testimony presented in this case over the past 6 weeks," he began, his voice a formal, powerful baritone that left no room for argument. "Ms. Chen," he nodded to my lawyer, "you have presented a clear and compelling case for your client's fitness as a parent, supported by extensive documentation and credible witness testimony." He then turned his gaze upon Grant's legal team. "Counselor," he said, his voice flat, "you have presented a vigorous, if largely circumstantial and often inflammatory, case against Ms. Vance. Your arguments have been noted." He paused, taking a long, deliberate moment to look from Grant to me and back again. "As I stated moments ago," he continued, his voice now imbued with a deep personal gravity, "a custody case at its heart is a judgment of character. It is about determining which parent is better equipped to instill in a child a sense of decency, empathy, and basic human kindness." He picked up his gavel, the simple wooden mallet suddenly feeling like the most powerful object in the world. "It is the ruling of this court," he declared, his voice ringing with a final, absolute authority, "that the case presented by the plaintiff, Mr. Donahue, is hereby dismissed. The evidence clearly shows that the mother, Ms. Vance, provides a stable, loving, and nurturing environment. Therefore, sole legal and physical custody of the child, Caleb Vance, is hereby awarded to Ms. Elara Vance." The words, sole, legal, and physical custody. The world, which had been a great, terrifying fog, suddenly burst into brilliant, dazzling color. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief tore from my chest, and I collapsed into my chair, my lawyer's arm wrapping around my shoulders in a gesture of shared, tearful triumph. But the judge was not finished. "It furthermore," he continued, his cold gaze now fixed on my ex-husband, "given Mr. Donahue's demonstrated lack of judgment, his clear attempts to manipulate this court through slander, and the questionable character he displayed this very morning, his visitation rights will be restricted to supervised visits, pending the completion of a court-mandated course in co-parenting and anger management." And then, with a single, sharp, and final crack, he brought the gavel down. The sound was a thunderclap, the end of the war. The courtroom erupted into a low murmur of shocked whispers. Grant was on his feet, his face a mask of purple, impotent rage. "This is an outrage," he sputtered. "You can't do this. I will appeal. You will be silent, Mr. Donahue, or I will hold you in contempt of court. This ruling is final. We are adjourned."
And with that, he stood, turned, and swept out of the courtroom through his private door, leaving behind the wreckage of my ex-husband's life. I walked out of that courthouse and into the bright, clean afternoon sun, holding my lawyer's hand on one side and my son, Caleb, who had been waiting with a court-appointed guardian, on the other. My victory was complete. It was not a victory born of wealth or power, but of simple, quiet decency. A few days later, Caleb and I were at the park. He was laughing, chasing a flock of pigeons, a child finally free from the heavy, toxic weight of the custody battle. I was sitting on a bench, watching him, a feeling of profound, quiet peace settling over me for the first time in years. "Miss Vance?" I looked up. It was Judge Finch. He was no longer in his formidable black robes, but in simple civilian clothes, a kind-faced old man walking his small, scruffy terrier. He smiled at me. "Judge," I said, standing up, my heart full of a gratitude I could not put into words. I never got the chance to properly thank you." He shook his head, his eyes twinkling. "Don't thank me, my dear," he said, his voice the same gentle, raspy voice as the janitor from the hallway. "You earned it. Your ex-husband came into my courtroom with an army of lawyers. You came in armed only with the truth of your character. It was not a fair fight." He smiled again. "For him." He looked over at my son, who was now trying to teach the little terrier how to play fetch. "You have a fine son," he said. "Raise him well." And with a final polite nod, he turned and continued on his walk. Just an old man and his dog. I watched him go, and I finally understood. My vindication wasn't about defeating Grant in court. It was the profound, beautiful affirmation that the values I held, the values I was trying to teach my son, kindness, compassion, integrity, were not weaknesses to be exploited, as my ex-husband believed. They were, in fact, the greatest strength a person could ever possess. I had won, not because of a clever legal trick, but simply because of who I was. And that was a victory that no amount of money could ever buy. An incredibly powerful and satisfying story about how true character will always win in the end. What do you think of the judge's unusual but effective test? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were inspired by this story of quiet integrity, please show your support by hitting that like button. And be sure to subscribe for more heartwarming stories of justice being served. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.